My name is James Carter. I'm 72 years old. For most of my life, nothing about me stood out. I worked with my hands. I kept my word. I showed up early and left when the job was done. That was enough for me. I spent 30 years as a municipal fire inspector, the kind of work where you notice problems before they turn into disasters. You learn to trust procedures. You learn that most emergencies start small. I was married once, long enough to know what routine feels like when it's good, and when it quietly stops being good. I raised 2 children, buried one close friend, watched others fade the slow way people do when time keeps its distance, but never really leaves. I wasn't religious. I wasn't hostile toward it either. It just wasn't something I leaned on. I believed in cause and effect. If something broke, there was a reason. If someone didn't make it, there was usually an explanation that fit on paper. Death, to me, was simple. The body stops. The systems shut down. Whatever you were thinking about before that moment doesn't matter anymore. I wasn't afraid of it. I also didn't spend time imagining anything beyond it. At my age, you get used to the idea that life narrows. Fewer surprises, fewer firsts. You don't expect anything to interrupt the pattern unless it's a diagnosis or a phone call you've been preparing for without admitting it. I had no interest in spiritual questions, no curiosity about what comes next. I didn't feel like I was missing anything by not asking. If you had asked me back then what waited after the body stopped working, I would have said nothing. Not in a dramatic way, just nothing. And I was comfortable with it. The day it started didn't feel important. I woke up with a mild ache behind my eyes and a heaviness in my chest that I couldn't quite place. Not pain, just pressure. The kind you ignore because it usually passes if you keep moving. I made coffee. Let it sit longer than usual because the smell didn't do much for me. I noticed that, but I didn't think anything of it. There was a flu moving through town that winter. Everyone knew someone who had it. Schools were half empty. Emergency rooms were crowded. It was one of those seasons where being sick felt normal enough that you didn't give it much weight. By late morning, my hands were unsteady. I remember standing in the kitchen and realizing I had leaned against the counter without deciding to. That caught my attention. I checked my temperature, slightly elevated. Nothing dramatic. I told myself to rest. That afternoon, the nausea started. Not sharp, just persistent. I couldn't keep water down. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed, waiting for the room to settle. It didn't. My heart felt fast. Not pounding, just fast enough to be noticeable. I went into the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. My face looked wrong. Not pale exactly, just unfamiliar, like I was seeing a version of myself from a bad angle. My pulse was hard to find at my wrist. That bothered me more than anything else. I tried calling my sister. My voice came out thin. I remember thinking how strange it was to hear myself sound like that. My niece picked up instead. I said my name. That was about all I could manage. She didn't ask questions. She hung up and called for help. When the paramedics arrived, I felt relieved in a way that surprised me. I hadn't realized how much effort it had taken just to stay upright. They started fluids immediately, asked questions I answered in pieces, loaded me onto a stretcher that felt colder than it should have. The hospital was full. Hallways lined with people coughing, vomiting, waiting. It smelled like antiseptic and something sour underneath it. I was put in a room. IVs were changed. Bags of fluid came and went. I lost track of how many. Someone mentioned dehydration. Someone else said my numbers were off. None of it sounded urgent in the way emergencies do on television. It was procedural, efficient. At one point, a nurse explained that everyone was receiving medication for pain and nausea. I remember thinking I felt clear enough to go home. She said the doctor hadn't seen me yet. Orders were orders. I was sitting up. My wife was there. The room felt steady. Then the medication went into the IV. That's the last thing I remember doing as a living man. You see, there wasn't a moment where I thought, this is it. There was no panic, no sense of urgency. What I remember instead is a kind of slipping, like a grip loosening without effort. One moment there was weight in my chest, the next there wasn't. The discomfort I had been aware of simply stopped reporting itself. The first thing that disappeared was my sense of position. I couldn't feel the bed beneath me. I couldn't feel the IV in my arm. I couldn't feel my hands or feet at all. That absence didn't register as loss. It felt neutral, almost practical. Sound faded unevenly, not all at once. The room noises didn't cut out, they thinned. Voices stretched and lost their edges like they were coming from another room with the door partly closed. I remember thinking, distantly, that it was odd how quiet everything was becoming. Then even that thought drifted away. What remained was awareness, not thought, not emotion in the way I'd known it. Just awareness without effort attached to it. There was no sense of breathing, but there was also no need to. The body wasn't asking for anything. At some point I realized I wasn't inside myself anymore. That realization didn't arrive as shock. It came as recognition, like noticing you've already stepped outside before realizing you opened the door. I didn't see my body, at least not in a visual sense. There was no image to focus on, but I knew it was behind me, not spatially behind exactly, more like no longer relevant. That knowledge didn't carry emotion. It felt factual. Time behaved differently there. Or maybe it didn't exist in the way I'm used to. There was no sequence, no waiting. Things didn't happen one after another, they simply were. I hesitate when I talk about this part because language starts to strain here. Part of me wonders if my mind was filling in gaps later, trying to give shape to something that didn't have one. I don't know. I can only describe what it felt like afterward, when memory tried to organize it. I remember thinking briefly that this must be what unconsciousness feels like, but that didn't fit either. I was more present than I'd ever been, not sharper, not excited, just complete in a way that didn't require attention. At one point there was a sense of space opening, not brightness, not darkness, something even, balanced. It wasn't empty, but it wasn't crowded either. The closest way I can describe it is that I felt held without being touched. I didn't ask where I was. I didn't wonder how long it would last. Those kinds of questions didn't occur to me. They belonged to a different state. And somewhere in that steadiness, I became aware that this was not sleep. Whatever was happening, it wasn't something I had experienced before, and it wasn't something I felt prepared to explain. The awareness I mentioned earlier didn't expand or intensify. It clarified. Like a lens being adjusted until nothing resisted focus, I was aware of myself, but not as a body or a role. My name didn't matter there. My age didn't register. The details I usually associate with being me weren't absent, but they were set aside, accessible but irrelevant. There was no sense of judgment. Not the absence of judgment as forgiveness, but the absence of the category entirely. Nothing was being measured. Nothing was being evaluated. At some point, I became aware of presences. That word feels imprecise, but it's the closest I can get. They weren't shapes at first. They didn't arrive. They were already there when I noticed them. 3 of them, distinct from one another but not separate in the way people are separate. I didn't see faces. What I noticed instead was a sense of attention directed toward me. Not scrutiny, not inspection. More like recognition. As if they knew exactly what I was without needing information. My reactions surprised me. I wasn't startled. I didn't question whether they were real. There was no urge to label them. I was aware that I didn't fully understand what I was experiencing and that awareness didn't bother me. Confusion usually carries tension. This didn't. It felt like being comfortable, not knowing. There was a sense of exchange, though I wouldn't call it communication. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be answered. It felt more like acknowledgement moving back and forth without language. There was also a broader presence, less defined, not closer or farther away, just there. If the others felt like points of attention, this felt like the field they existed within. Being near it created a physical response, even without a body. A tightening, then a release. A sense of being known completely without being exposed. All I can say, honestly, is that the feeling associated with that presence was overwhelming in a way I'd never experienced. I became aware, then, of my life. It was just visible, and I understood it without commentary. I didn't feel regret. I didn't feel predictably proud either. The life I had lived felt finished in a way that didn't require correction. And that's when a clear thought surfaced. I didn't want to go back. I knew my body existed. I knew it was somewhere else. That knowledge didn't create attachment. It felt distant, like remembering an address you no longer live at. I didn't ask to stay. I didn't argue. The desire itself felt sufficient. Then something shifted. Not abruptly, not forcefully. Just enough for me to understand that this experience was not meant to continue. That understanding didn't come as instruction. It arrived as fact. And even then, there was no resistance, only reluctance. A quiet one. The kind you feel when you're asked to leave somewhere you didn't realize you were allowed to love. Now, my return didn't feel like waking up. It felt like being pulled backward through something too narrow to notice until it tightened. The steadiness I'd been in didn't collapse. It thinned, like a signal losing clarity. The sense of space I'd been aware of began to fragment, breaking into pieces that didn't quite line up. Then weight came back. Not all at once. First pressure, then resistance. Then something heavy and unfamiliar pressing in from all sides. Sound followed. Not voices yet. Just noise. Beeps. Air moving. A mechanical rhythm that didn't belong to me. I remember opening my eyes and closing them again because the effort felt excessive. My chest hurt. My throat felt dry and raw. There was a moment of confusion where I couldn't tell whether I was breathing or being breathed for. Then someone said my name, And that was the moment frustration hit. I remember thinking, why am I back here? The question wasn't philosophical, it was practical. I had been somewhere that didn't require effort. This did. The next hours are fragmented. Nurses adjusting equipment. A doctor explaining something about a reaction to medication. My wife's face stayed in focus longer than anything else. She looked exhausted. Physically, recovery took time. Strength returned slowly. The body reminded me of its limits in small, persistent ways. That part made sense. What didn't make sense was how ordinary everything felt afterward. The world hadn't changed. The room was still a room. The hospital still smelled like disinfectant. Conversations returned to schedules and paperwork. Life resumed without acknowledging what had interrupted it. Inside me, though, something stayed unsettled. I don't feel qualified to explain what happened, only to say that it did. What changed most was how seriously I take being here, not in a dramatic way, in a practical one. Conversations matter more. Time feels heavier. Wasted hours register. Now, I don't know where I was. I don't know what it means. I only know it wasn't nothing. I'm not here to convince anyone. I'm just telling you what happened to me while I was gone.